Welcome, everyone, to a new deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're jumping straight into a really fascinating exchange. It's captured in a Forbes Breaking News YouTube video transcript.
That's right. It's a conversation between Representative Watson Coleman and the Secretary of Labor.
And our goal here really is to unpack this specific interaction.
Yeah, we want to pull out the crucial insights about, well, first, the Job Corps program they discuss.
And also how these big government studies actually, drive policy decisions.
Exactly. And it gets into some broader, pretty intense questions about equity and opportunity, too.
Absolutely. Think of this as a window into how top policymakers grapple with evaluating programs designed to help very specific groups.
Often the most vulnerable populations, right?
Right. And it really highlights the different philosophies, the different ways they think about measuring success and trying to ensure fairness.
It really does. And the conversation kicks off focusing heavily on Job Corps.
Okay, so what is Job Corps, according to the source material here?
Well, it's described as a program specifically for young people, aged 16 to 24.
And it's noted right away, these are young people predominantly from minority and low-income backgrounds.
Yeah, and Representative Watson Coleman highlights some really key services it provides. Things like
opportunities for college education.
And connecting participants with unions for apprenticeships. That's a big one she mentions.
Okay. And also providing residential options.
Yes, importantly, residential options that can remove young people from what she actually calls dangerous living situations.
So she really frames it as offering a new lease on life.
Absolutely. From her perspective in this exchange, it sounds like much more than just job training. It's fundamental.
Like a safety net and a pathway creator.
Precisely.
Now, the Secretary's view, at least initially here, seems heavily shaped by data from a Department of Labor report.
Yes, exactly. She refers to a Job Corps transparency report, calls it the most comprehensive report that has been done on the program.
So she's really basing her concerns, her decisions, directly on the findings in that study.
That's the impression, yeah.
And the numbers she pulls out, well, they sound pretty stark, at least from her perspective.
They are. She mentions figures for a specific district, but then gives some stats she says are across the board.
Okay, so what are those numbers?
Right. So the report cited shows a cost of $56,000 per enrollee.
Per person just enrolling. Okay.
But then the cost per graduate, particularly for the district mentioned, it jumps way up.
How high?
$268,000.
Wow. $268K per graduate in that case.
Yeah. And across the board, she says only about 1/3 of participants actually graduate.
Only a third make it through.
And maybe the most critical point for the Secretary's argument here, the average earnings for those who do graduate.
What are they earning after the program?
Only about $16,000 a year.
$16,000. Okay. So looking at those figures side by side, that cost per graduate, $268K in one case versus $16K earnings.
You can immediately see why the Secretary expresses concern.
Yeah. She states it directly, right? Just the discrepancy alone concerns me.
Exactly that. That huge gap between the investment to get someone through and what they earn afterward. That's a major, well, a red flag for her based on this data.
But it's important you mention the source shows she immediately adds something else.
Right. She says that doesn't mean the population we should forget about.
Okay, so the data on efficiency is a concern, clearly, but she's not dismissing the need to serve this group.
Correct. Which really sets the stage perfectly for Representative Watson Coleman's response and her core questions.
And she doesn't necessarily defend the program as perfect, does she?
No, not entirely. She says she doesn't agree it has done its job as best it can, but she frames the issue differently.
How so?
She suggests that maybe we don't necessarily hold people up to the standards that we expect.
Oh, that's a fascinating shift. So the problem might not just be the program itself, but maybe how it's run, how participants are supported, or maybe even how we measure success beyond just, getting them out the door. Right. So her central challenge to the Secretary then becomes what?
It's basically, okay, if this data looks bad to you, what's your actual plan? What's the proposal to give this specific population what they need? Safety, security, college access, apprenticeships.
She asks, essentially, what do you have that is concretely better than that?
Exactly.
And this is where the conversation really pivots, takes a sharp turn.
It does. Representative Watson Coleman connects this whole evaluation of Job Corps to much broader, you could say more politically charged concepts.
Like what?
Specifically, affirmative action and contract compliance.
Okay, how does she make that connection?
Well, she argues that these policies, these concepts, they didn't just appear out of thin air. right?
They came from somewhere.
They came into existence, she says, because of verified studies that showed underutilization and the lack of opportunity for women and minorities.
And she links this directly to a history where these groups faced discrimination.
Yes. She says they were treated discriminatorily in employment and contracting. She specifically mentions MBEWB.
And just quickly, for listeners, MBEWBE stands for Minority Business Enterprises and Women Business Enterprises.
Right. Categories often targeted by policies trying to ensure a fair share of contracts go to businesses owned by minorities or women.
Got it. So Rep. Watson-Coleman's point, as presented here, is that policies like these were needed responses to documented discrimination.
Yes. And then she uses a very strong language. She says, it seems to me that the president is hell-bent on eliminating that opportunity to create equity among people in this country who have been treated discriminatorily.
Wow. That's an incredibly direct accusation, linking decisions about specific programs or policies to a perceived intentional dismantling of equity efforts.
It is. And the secretary's direct response to that specific point about discrimination is quite firm.
What does she say?
Absolutely not. We won't discriminate against any of our Americans.
But Representative Watson-Coleman pushes back on that response.
She does. Her reply shows her skepticism. She says, I appreciate your rhetoric, but I'm watching what he's saying and what he's doing.
Which really highlights that fundamental tension, doesn't it? The stated goals versus the perceived actions and outcomes.
Absolutely. And then the secretary explains a significant constraint she's operating under. It affects certain programs, including one for older workers mentioned later, and maybe aspects related to affirmative action.
What's the constraint?
She states she can't discuss them fully because they are subject, again, to litigation on the grant funding.
So there are active CROC cases involving the funding. That's a critical piece of context.
It is. It means she effectively can't lay out specific alternative plans or even defend certain aspects publicly in this forum because they're tied up legally.
Which really limits her ability to directly answer Representative Watson-Coleman's challenge about what's better than that.
Exactly. It puts her in a difficult position in that part of the exchange.
Okay. Now, stepping back just briefly to Job Corps itself, there was another detail mentioned about how the centers are run.
Yes, that they're structured as private-public partnerships.
Meaning they're not all run identically by the government.
Right. There are different operators involved.
Yeah.
Representative Watson-Coleman actually asks about this, whether it's one big operator or different ones.
And the secretary confirms.
She confirms they can be different, yeah. And notes that the transparency report might have more details on whether one operator is dominant across the whole system.
Okay. So moving away from the youth programs for a moment, Representative Watson-Coleman also raises another distinct concern.
She does. About the possible elimination of a program that provided jobs, she says, of whatever nature, to older people.
Specifically older people who were low income and needed that extra money.
Right. And she feels quite strongly about the impact. She says it feels like we're punishing older people who need to work.
Strong words again. And she presses the secretary on this point, too.
Yeah, she asks how the secretary plans to protect those individuals of that ilk, that age group who need to work.
She's pushing for a concrete plan, a vision that exists, sort of, irrespective of those lawsuits the secretary mentioned.
Exactly. She's trying to get past the legal constraints and understand the department's underlying commitment and strategy for this other vulnerable group.
So how does the secretary respond to that or wrap up her points in this excerpt?
Well, her final statement that's captured here circles back to the broader purpose of the agency she leads, the Department of Labor.
What does she say their mission is?
She states her job, the department's job, is to focus on all the American workers wherever they are in their continuum of the workforce.
Okay. A broad statement meant to encompass everyone from young people to older adults.
Yes. But, in the context of this very pointed exchange about specific groups and programs potentially facing cuts or major changes, it serves as her final framing of the department's overall responsibility.
So let's try to put all these pieces together then. We've got the data concerns about Job Corps, the arguments about equity and history, the secretary's constraints due to litigation, the questions about older workers. What's the key takeaway for you from this whole exchange?
Well, I think what this deep dive really illuminates is this fundamental tension. It's right at the heart of how policy gets evaluated and implemented.
A tension between what?
On one side, you have this drive for efficiency and accountability, measured through quantifiable data, right? Cost per graduate, earnings, completion rates, like the secretary highlighted, using that report.
Okay, the data-driven side. And on the other side?
You have the argument for the broader value, maybe harder to measure societal value of these programs. Things like providing safety, a second chance, a pathway to opportunity.
And actively working to counteract historical discrimination, to create equity, the things Representative Watson-Coleman was championing.
Exactly. The source shows us policymakers really grappling with how to balance those numbers from a study with the human stories, the lived experiences, and the historical context that led to these programs in the first place.
They clearly have different perspectives on what success really looks like for these programs and how best to achieve fairness.
Absolutely. It really brings to the forefront the challenge, of evaluating social programs when the very metrics you choose to use can dramatically change how you perceive their success or failure.
That's a really crucial point. The metrics themselves shape the narrative.
Definitely. And it leads to a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to consider.
Okay.
Think about that immense challenge policymakers face. They have to weigh these measured program costs and outcomes, the hard data, against those broader, maybe less quantifiable goals. Goals like safety nets, opportunity, equity.
Especially when these decisions directly bump up against really sensitive issues like discrimination and historical disadvantage.
Right. It's incredibly complex. So, listening to this exchange, hearing both perspectives, what stands out to you? What feels most significant about this debate?